There's a large region on the edge of Eastern Asia, largely forgotten by the West. So remote that we're not even able to name it precisely. Russian Siberia or Chinese Siberia, Manchuria or Heilongjiang, the Chinese name for the Amur River or Black Dragon River, which separates this immense region in two. Sometimes Chinese, sometimes Russian, even briefly Japanese. It's at the center of a new geopolitical game between Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China. The border formed by the Amur River between Siberia and China is no longer enough to curb Beijing's ambitions, nor the Chinese people's need for more land. Demographic pressure in China is so intense that borders are already shifting due to a dwindling Russian presence. For the Chinese, it's a question of survival. They need food and energy. For the Russians, it's a question of territorial integrity. They need to protect it. If Putin plays a game of chess with the West, in the East, it's a game of Go. On March 22, 2013, China's new Communist Party leader Xi Jinping chose to visit Moscow and Vladimir Putin on his first overseas trip. Was this the day on which Russian-Chinese rapprochement was cemented? Did Putin, knowing he would face the West's anger for Ukraine and Crimea, realize he'd be forced to ally himself in the East with China?
Russia feels confident with China, Central Asia and India. And that's why it's now realigning itself towards the East. During the Stalin era, Russia was an Eastern authoritarian regime, and it sought allies in the East, turning its back on the West, marking its borders with the Iron Curtain. Today, the situation is more or less the same. Russia under Putin, not Russia historically, but Russia under Putin, is filled with fear, mistrust and contempt for Europe.
With the war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, Vladimir Putin became a pariah, especially after July 17, 2014, when a plane carrying 298 passengers was shot down by a Russian-manufactured missile. Whispers of a new Cold War floated between Moscow and its Western allies.
Now that we have a better perspective of the events in Ukraine, we see that the regime is still in that downward phase, in decline, in crisis, in tension, to the point of resorting to hysterical propaganda to try to convince Russia's 140 million inhabitants, as well as the world, that Russia is a big, powerful country, and that Russia can do anything, when that's absolutely not the case.
On May 9, 2015, in Moscow, Russia celebrated the end of the Second World War with the largest military parade since the fall of the Soviet Union.
The Great Patriotic War was actually a battle for the future of all humanity. Our fathers and grandfathers endured suffering, hardships and unthinkable losses. They pushed themselves past exhaustion, past human limits. They fought to the death. They gave us a shining example of honor and true patriotism. Glory to our glorious people, and congratulations on the day of victory.
The break with the West was complete, with no Western head of state present. China, honored by President Putin, was represented by the presence of President Xi Jinping and the participation of a Chinese army battalion in the parade. China's military spending, in constant growth, is second only to that of the United States and has outstripped that of Russia. In addition to its growing military superiority, China has an advantage over Russia: demographics. Russia's population, currently at 140 million, is set to decline, dropping to 120 million in 2050, the same level as its population a century ago. The same holds true for Russian Siberia, where the population will decrease from 7 to 5 million.
The government is concerned about the Far East, and taking into account the country's depopulation in general, it's even more striking in the Far East, a region which is remote and dying. For example, Chukotka, in the north of the Far East, has lost 2/3 of its population in 25 years. During the Soviet era, the government encouraged people to move there, promising high salaries and good careers. But today, many are leaving the region. The only ones who remain are the natives, and there aren't many of them.
On the Chinese side are 120 million people crammed into the regions near the Amur River, with 33 million in the Heilongjiang province alone. The contrast is striking, and the Russians imagine hordes of Chinese people overflowing into the Far East lands. A migration of northeastern Chinese, already accustomed to the harsh and icy climate, can only lead to, in Russian eyes, worrying population movements, and in the long term, change the region's geopolitics.
We have a term called the Western Drift. It refers to migration from regions in the Urals, in the east, towards the west. There are migratory flows on both sides, but the flow towards the west is predominant. That's why migration is lowering the population of Siberia and the Far East. There's nothing we can do. The country's demographic resources are extremely limited.
With its 220 million hectares of farmland and unexploited fallow ground, Russia arouses the keen interest of its populous neighbor. Russia has 11% of the world's arable land, while China has only 7% to feed 1.4 billion inhabitants, 10 times the population of Russia. If China is capable of seeking out new territory across the globe, it sees nearby Siberian Russia as an El Dorado within easy reach.
China wanted to fix the problem of its borders and was pretty successful throughout the 80s and 90s and even up until recently over its entire periphery. Nonetheless, it conserves the memory of its lost territories. Although, of course, there was an agreement between Moscow and Beijing about the Sino-Russian borders, but that's not saying that an ambitious regime, more ambitious than the one currently in power, might start talking about the historical traces of Chinese presence in these regions.
Indeed, almost 4 centuries ago, the Amur River was Chinese on both sides. The Qing dynasty brought China to its pinnacle, both culturally and territorially. At the time, a large part of the Siberian Far East belonged to the Chinese Empire. Two centuries later, Tsarist Greater Russia was defeated in Crimea in 1856 in a war with France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire. This defeat in the West would prompt a reaction in the East. In 1858, Russian forces annexed the territories north of the Amur and west of the Ussuri, gaining free navigation rights on the river. Khabarovsk was the first city founded after the seizure of these territories. The port city of Vladivostok, literally ruler of the East, was the result of the Russian push towards the Pacific. The same Vladivostok that the Chinese still call Heishenwai, meaning sea cucumber cliffs.
China was one of the 5 countries ranged against the Soviet Union, with the US, West Germany, Israel, and Britain. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Chinese development model attracted Moscow's attention. In parallel, a fairly aggressive anti-Chinese propaganda campaign was launched. There was talk of the Yellow Peril, the colonization of the Far East by China, and the fact that many Chinese were settling there. These type of scare stories had considerable success from the mid-90s until 2005.
Today, in rural regions, such stories seem like ancient history. The Russians have already given in, renting the Chinese over 100,000 hectares of land on 50-year leases. Here they grow genetically modified soybeans exclusively for the Chinese market, which imports millions of tons of them each year. All Russia could come up with to solve the huge labor shortage was to offer its citizens 1 free hectare.
Представьте себе москвича или даже жителя российской провинции.
Why would a Russian from Moscow or elsewhere leave their apartment and move to Siberia for a hectare of land? With a hectare, if all goes well, you can feed your family with potatoes. To create an agricultural business, you need dozens of hectares. If you want to consolidate your business, you need property in your name and a building permit. But that doesn't exist. People know they're being taken in. What's 1 hectare for a country of over 17 million square kilometers?
17 миллионов квадратных километров.
If I don't work 24 hours a day, I might as well quit farming. Unless I plant 1,000 hectares, I'm working at a loss. I have no time to sleep. And see the guy who just arrived? He went to bed at 7 in the morning. He comes in, fills his tank, and goes back to work. He worked 24 hours straight. In such a situation, Russians don't want to work. I can't pay a Russian a decent salary by farming grain. And what's more, today there's nobody to teach them. In the old days, near our place in Kamychovka, there was a farm school. They trained people to drive tractors, but now that's gone.
How large is this farm?
3,000 hectares.
And back home?
4 hectares per person.
Not like here.
No, here we work for other people.
How are you hired?
Through a Chinese friend of our boss.
Your Russian boss has Chinese friends?
Yes, there are lots of Chinese farmers here in Russia.
To give the illusion of controlling the immigration of Chinese workers, Moscow is still desperately trying to slow their arrival. Now, all foreign workers are required to pass an exam to prove their knowledge of the Russian language before receiving their work visa. In reality, however, the law is unworkable, and employers find ways around it because the real problem is that it's impossible to find any workers except the Chinese.
This law isn't adapted to the situation in the Far East. Its requirements are very strange in light of the existing labor shortage. In addition, it increases the cost of labor.
Why did you come here? For the money?
To live and to earn money. It's easier here than in China. If you're a good worker, you're paid well in rubles, and then you go home.
This business in the Far East isn't bad. People are nice. All the paperwork was handled quickly. Legally, of course. This document is a work visa. Whenever we had visa problems, the Russians helped us solve them.
Can you say a few words for us in Russian?
How
about hello?
Привет, здравствуйте.
In Moscow, there are 8 suicides per 100,000 people every year. In the Khabarovsk region, or in Kamchatka, it's between 80 and 100. And these are much higher numbers.
We're
talking about very poor regions where life is really harsh and hopeless. People don't have the means to leave these places.
Today, a Russian man has a life expectancy of 62 years, the same as an Ethiopian. In the near future, the wave of Chinese migration will no longer be transitory. The Chinese will stay in large numbers, especially since Moscow's encouragement measures for Russians have proven ineffective.
Demographers have concluded that there's no other choice but to bring in 20 million Chinese.
If we want Siberia to be inhabited by bears, we're doing everything to make it happen. But it would be better, wouldn't it, if it were inhabited by people? For that, we must attract them with incentives. This means we must bid farewell to the fantasy of centralized power that gives Putin such joy.
In 2011, Russia created a Ministry of the Far East, which, despite a budget of 125 billion euros, turned out to be totally unproductive. Putin's administration, 9,000 kilometers from Vladivostok, prefers to fund projects that are ostentatious, of little use, and of zero benefit to the inhabitants, like the construction of a gigantic bridge to link Vladivostok to Ruski Island, a deserted and wind-ravaged place. In terms of investments, the Chinese have a huge advantage because of the cash pouring in. Blagoveshchenk's showcase of Chinese success in the Siberian Far East is across the river from the Chinese city of Haihei. If there were no border, the entire urban area would form a single city. The Chinese telephone networks work perfectly and completely ignore national borders. Since Russia was placed under international economic sanctions, the Russian economy has been in recession.
Our Chinese partners invest by borrowing at home at interest rates of 5 or 6%. Meanwhile, here in Russia, the interest rates are around 26%. At a time when the entire world is lowering interest rates to fight the economic crisis, Russia is raising its rates. I don't understand it.
Apart from raw materials, the Russian economy hasn't managed to be competitive in regional and international markets. Plus, the sanctions are also affecting the banking and financial sector. The Russians, both the government and the businesses and the banks, have difficulty finding financing on world markets, even in Asia. I don't think Moscow had anticipated that in a global economy you can't just say, we're not speaking to Europe anymore, and then expect everything to open up miraculously in Asia. Today, everything is connected.
Concerning the Chinese conquest of the northern lands, the so-called dreamland, well, it's just a fantasy. How can I put this? Do they need to conquer the Far East for that? I think it's enough to make good investments.
Li Wengui is the model of the accomplished and well-integrated Chinese businesswoman. A Russian partner, a 7-year-old daughter, 5 restaurants, 1 bistro. But most importantly, a brick factory with 800,000 square meters of land, soon to be covered with apartment buildings. For Li Wenhui, the future lies in building further apartments to accommodate the influx of her compatriots.
I arrived in Blagoveshchensk for the first time in late October of 1992. It was cold, and I was wearing very thick pants. The Russian girls were wearing high-heeled boots with pantyhose and skirts. They were so beautiful. I'd never seen that in China. I was used to wearing the same clothes night and day, but they would change before going to bed. That was new for me.
Right
now, we're only making red bricks the traditional way. But in 1 or 2 years, we'd like to invest in more modern equipment in order to produce all year round. We conducted a market analysis in the Amur region, and there's a production potential of 1 billion red bricks per year.
The Chinese are no longer afraid to make their presence known. The Chinese city of Hegang has a commercial office in the center of a Russian town.
If there are too many Chinese in Siberia, there might even be more Chinese than Russians. The Russians are afraid the Chinese won't return to their country and stay in Russia. That will cause a huge change in demographics and even the political situation. What's more, there will be surely friction, cultural, ethnic, religious, even economic. Right now, it's not very serious. But if one day the Chinese become rich, it'll be different.
There are businessmen and businesswomen prospering in all the border regions. Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Blagoveshchensk, and even all the way to Irkutsk, with big profits, not only for the Chinese, of course, but also for the Russians. And that brings us back to the balance between the desire to see this prosperity spill over into the Russian territories and the concern that this dynamic could lead to situations that are much harder for Russians to accept.
The birth rate in Russia is decreasing despite the incentive of around 9,000 euros for women to have a second child. Mixed couples are rare here because the Russian population remains distant and suspicious of the Chinese, or even worse.
Russian society, after a period of feigned tolerance and internationalism, is becoming much more archaic, traditionalist and racist. The level of xenophobia has increased greatly.
China and the Chinese don't seem to care much about that racism. What matters are future profits. The number of Chinese on the move continues to increase, and this serves the interests of the Chinese government, which accepts this emigration and even encourages it. The Russian government accepts it as well, like two authoritarian governments who've decided at the highest level to become allies.
The type of power that exists in China doesn't threaten Putin in the least. Beijing won't be interested in human rights violations or the annexation of territories belonging to other countries, as long as it doesn't directly concern China. It won't impose restrictions like the West does. The government will interact with the Chinese, who will settle in Russian territories, especially Siberia. The Chinese people will adapt to this system, which establishes the worst characteristics of domination and personal power.
Khabarovsk is the central link where all the deals are made between Chinese investors and Russian businessmen looking for financing.
Полезные ископаемые доказанных запасов 115 сортов, в том числе запасов полезных ископаемых горючих сванцев, молибдена, никеля, магния.
I represent the assistant director of a technical commercial company based in the Jilin province.
How much are you prepared to invest? Is there a limit?
No, we don't have a limit. There are lots of financial corporations who visit this forum. Many among them are ready to offer their services to lots of companies.
On the Chinese side, rail links to the Russian Far East are already in place. The Chinese high-speed train lines connecting Beijing to the north are almost finished. They have no Russian authorization to cross the border, yet they're there, ready for the extension. On the Russian side, they wonder if Birobidzhan, the autonomous oblast created in 1928 as a homeland for Jews from Russia and around the world, hasn't been waiting for the Chinese to awaken this dormant land abundant in ore and resources. This iron mine, for example, is entirely Chinese-built and has 1,000 workers and engineers living there full-time. A Chinese enclave which seems to elude the central government in Moscow. Today, it's the biggest industrial project in far eastern Siberia, waiting to be connected to the Chinese rail network, when the first bridge crossing the Amur River into Russia is completed.
Russia is becoming China's satellite state. It's a sad fact, but entirely true. If we don't want to be a satellite to the West, we're forced to be a satellite to the East. Yet we still say Russia is a Euro-Asian state, independent of the West and the East. That's an error, because Russia under Putin cannot be an independent geopolitical force on its own. That's why it's becoming increasingly dependent on the Chinese East.
Today, China wants to build the new Silk Road. And in Pakistan, or Myanmar, for example, without China's effort, this road will never exist. From Xinjiang to Europe, how many countries must it cross? If the political power of these countries change, how will China react? For example, if Kazakhstan turns into a new Ukrainian crisis, or if President Nazarbayev dies, how can China secure the first leg of the road? It could cause problems.
For the new Silk Road through Central Asia, crossing Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, China needs Russia's blessing. On the sidelines of the APEC summit in Beijing in November 2014, with U.S. President Barack Obama arriving the same day, President Putin and Xi Jinping signed an extremely lucrative deal worth $400 billion. It involved Russia's Gazprom supplying an additional 30 billion cubic meters of gas per year to China for 30 years.
Concerning the maritime Silk Road from China to the west, it has to cross the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. Recently, they acquired a port of entry through Greece. How can China quickly mobilize the entire world to maintain the traffic on this route and ensure the security of the maritime road?
China and Russia continue to make their moves, but hasn't the game already been won?
China doesn't need Russia. Perhaps right now, but only temporarily, in order to show the United States that Russia has become its satellite state. This reinforces China's position in its confrontation with the US, given China's ambitions to take the place of the United States. The Russian Federation doesn't understand that. Russia and China as partners are incompatible. China wants to force the US to find a new negotiation tactic, and if it fails, China will use Russia against the West.
In any case, it would have been difficult not to notice the military parade organized by the Chinese Communist Party on September 3, 2015, marking the 70th anniversary of Japan's surrender in the Second World War. Positioned alongside Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin seemed to be reliving his own parade in May 2015. It would seem that each military parade finds them side by side, united in yet another show of force for the United States and its allies. The Sino-Russian Siberian border is nothing more than a moving line separating an unpopulated territory from a population that needs land. As in a game of Go, encirclement seems inevitable. The Chinese leaders, who for years followed Chairman Deng Xiaoping's advice to be discreet and to conceal their power, have abandoned that attitude. They now openly display their ambitions. Chinese expansionism is at its prologue in a global strategy which looks 50 years into the future. Learning from the Soviet failure, the Chinese Communist Party wishes to be eternal, in the image of the red-crowned crane that lives on both banks of the Amur River. In China, it's a symbol of immortality.